we have another version of this. It's placed later in the narrative as if it were a separate event, but it seems pretty clear it's another version of the same one. Well, let's see. Agabus is mentioned in this just as he was in chapter 11. He warns Paul of his impending arrest and so on. And okay, in chapter 21, verse 15, after these 2 days we prepared ourselves and headed up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and some of the disciples from Caesarea also went with us, bringing us to one with whom we might lodge, Manason, a certain Cypriot, a disciple from the very early days. And leaving there, we arrived in Jerusalem, where the brothers gave us a joyful welcome. And on the next day, Peter went in with us to James, and all the elders joined him. And once he greeted them, he recounted one by one each of the successes God had granted among the Gentiles through his ministry. Hearing it, they worshipped God and said to him, as for our work, you can see for yourself, brother, how many thousands of the Jews have believed. And every one of them is a zealot for the Torah. And they have been informed about you that you teach all the Jews throughout the nations to commit apostasy from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to live by the customs. So what is to be done? The mob will surely gather, for they will certainly hear of your arrival. So we suggest you follow this plan. There are 4 men among us who are under a vow. You too are completing a vow, aren't you? Take these and be purified jointly with them and pay for having their heads shaved, and this will reassure everyone that there is nothing to the rumors they've heard about you, but that you yourself live scrupulously by the Torah. As for the believing Gentiles, they have no complaint against you, since we wrote them ruling that they need observe nothing of that sort except to steer clear of both idol. Then Paul took them in the next day, and undergoing purification along with them, went into the temple, setting the end of the purification period when the requisite offerings should be made on behalf of each. Now when so he's got a bunch of money to be able to do that, right? Now when the 7 days were done, the Jews who had come up from Asia spotted him in the temple and stirred up the crowd and got him in their clutches, yelling out, "Men, Israelites, help! This is the man, the one who teaches all men everywhere against the Jewish people and the Torah and against this holy place." And they had earlier seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and they assumed Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was in an uproar, with masses of people rushing together, and they grabbed hold of Paul and dragged him out of the temple, immediately closing the doors. When they were about to lynch him, the report came to the commander of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in chaos. So he rescues Paul, etc. Paul then, a little bit later, explains what we have already inferred. But let's see, we find explicitly stated, oh boy, he says he was all right, got it. In 24:17, he's speaking to Felix. After many years, I arrived bringing alms and offerings to my nation. With these, some Jews from Asia found me in the temple, having been purified, not with a crowd, nor with an uproar. So that's a comment on what we just read in 21. He had brought offerings to his nation, and they didn't. And so James doesn't accept them directly. He says, "Look, we're in a tight spot here. As a PR move, why don't you take that money and pay for the ritual purification, the head shaving, etc. of these Nazarite vow guys? You're doing the same, I notice. Why don't you just do it with them and you pay their tab? And that way everybody will see, hey, well, isn't that Paul? Hey, isn't he the one we heard says not to keep the Torah? Well, look what he's doing. I guess what we heard was wrong. Great. But it misfires, right? They say, what is this? Look who's here. And this Trophimus guy's bringing a Greek in here. He's profaning the temple. That SOB. And so who are the mob? Well, as Bauer pointed out, it had to be the ones that are mentioned immediately before the mob in chapter 21, not vacationing pilgrims from Asia Minor, but rather the many thousands of Jews of Jerusalem who are zealots for the law. But Luke covers that up slightly, right? Because the original point was the Jerusalem Christians are about to lynch Paul and will not accept the money he brought as tribute to the spiritual capital of Jerusalem. So this is typical of Luke. He knows this story, but breaks it up in different ways. And why? Well, here's your question about F.C. Bauer. Bauer correctly saw that Acts is a compromised document trying to get the pro and anti-Torah factions of Christianity together, who also happen to be the pro-Peter and pro-Paul factions. Now, he thought that they were first century factions of Christians, which they could have been. But I think the Dutch radicals are right. It's better to go with parties that we know existed and argued with one another in these terms, namely Marcionites, whose figurehead was Paul and who rejected the Torah completely, against the Roman Catholic Church, which said, oh no, Peter is the one on whom the church is founded. Peter is the one who was granted the revelation directly by God. Peter is the one who's the head honcho, not that Paul guy. And so the attempt is to get those two groups together, which didn't exactly happen. It didn't completely work. Marcionites were eventually stamped out. But whoever wrote this, and I think it was probably Polycarp of Smyrna, was trying to unify both groups by saying, hey, Paul's all right. He just didn't teach all that heresy that the Marcionites ascribed to him. Peter, you Marcionites, you ought to see that Peter's all right, because everything God did through Paul, as you yourselves believe, look at the book here. He also did it through Peter. He must have been working, as Galatians says, through both of them in the same way at the same time. You can hardly say that one was from God and one was not. So let's get together here. And it was an interesting compromise platform. From that standpoint, some of the later New Testament books besides Acts are written, namely 1st and 2nd Peter, which make Peter sound very Pauline and even mention Paul by name, and says it's too bad that some heretical nuts are twisting Paul's writings and so forth. And First Peter even seemed to be based on Ephesians, even if a couple of his guesses as to who was who might have been wrong, and that's only a maybe. And so Simon Magus did have a major role in whatever altercation underlay the Jerusalem Council, but that story in Acts 15 is fictitious. Just like all these other stories we've seen in Acts, Galatians, and the preaching of Peter are fictitious. They're based on her. And Simon Magus, of course, is Paul. Was he originally known as Paul or Saul or Simon? That's a bit of a mess, because you can take Simon and Paul as titles. I get into that a bit in my book, The Amazing Colossal Apostle. Well, great question. Very long-winded answer. Hope you're still awake. Thanks for being with us on the Bible.